Hi, I'm Melissa Finley. Welcome to part 2 of Dueling Dates and Fact Fights, Resolving Evidence Conflicts. In part 1 of this presentation, we discussed that the fourth element of the genealogical proof standard is the resolution of conflicting evidence. We defined conflicting evidence as evidence from different sources that can contradict each other. And we discussed where and why we might find conflicting evidence in our research. Now, let's discuss some solutions and examples to resolve evidence conflicts. First and foremost, check your assumptions. We all go into our research with certain assumptions, and it might cause us to skip a key piece of information because we assumed too much. So what kind of assumptions do we make in our research? Well, we assume our ancestors participated in certain types of activities at certain ages and not at others. We assume groups of people we find together in documents had certain relationships with each other. We cherry pick information out of documents that matches our assumptions, and sometimes that makes us gloss over the rest, which may actually contradict our preconceived scenario. So in order to avoid assumption traps, we need to consider alternative scenarios. We need to make sure the document or source states what we think that it states. And we always need to try to build proof from multiple sources if possible. So here's a quick example. Here we have the Percy Farnworth household from Meridian, Idaho in 1900. And we have Percy as the head, Nora his wife, and then several children labeled as sons and daughters. So from this census, we would assume, that the relationships that are stated are true. Percy was the husband, Nora was the wife, and they had 5 children. However, if we look at other records, we would learn that Ovid, the oldest son listed, was not actually Percy's son. He is Nora's son from her first marriage. But you can't figure this out from the census because the census got it wrong and it created a conflict with other records. But we could have just gone on the assumption that that relationship was true and put that in our tree and been done with it. But our assumptions would have made us put an incorrect relationship in our tree. Next, we need to really take a deep look at the geography that is involved in our research. So I highly encourage that you use historic maps to understand the place that you're looking in for that time period. I have an example where I thought we had conflicting evidence in our family tree. This is actually on my husband's Irish side, the Finley family. And this is sort of the northwest coast of Ireland. And we had several children in a family born in what seemed to be different parts of Ireland. And I was very confused about why this family would be bouncing around Ireland having children. That just didn't seem to make sense, especially because if you can see from the numbers, number 1, she was born down along the very sort of Midwest coast. Then the second group of children was born up on the northwest coast, and then they came back down for the third group of children. But then as I was gathering more evidence, I noticed their father's death record stated that he was a pensioner with the Coast Guard, and that was the career he had. So I went looking for records of his career. And then I started mapping out his career, and it turns out his children were simply born where he was stationed for the Coast Guard, and he did bounce around along the coastline for his job. And so then my evidence conflicts were all gone. But it took a lot of looking at the places and figuring out how all the records fit together in order to resolve what seemed to be conflicting evidence. My third tip is to use logic. So just like in real life, in our genealogical research, our possibilities are limited by time and physics. I was looking one day at a branch of my family tree that I had never personally researched. I looked at the Ellen Peterson family. I looked at her profile on FamilySearch, and I noticed that she had a lot of records from 2 different places in Denmark. So I probably won't be pronouncing these places right, but Torup and Rorvig. And I looked these up on a map, and they're not too far apart. They're only about 13 kilometers apart. So it's, she could definitely be traveling between those places at different time periods. But I wanted to take a closer look at, how these records kind of fit together. So I started to break them apart and analyze them. And here's how it broke down. In Torup, she married Hans Jacobsen in 1752. Then she appeared in Rorvig and married Lars Rasmussen in 1753. That same year, she was back in Torup having baby Jacob. And then the next year, she was back in Rorvig having Peter. Then bounced back to Eric in Torup. And then she stayed there for a while and had Peter. And then she went back to Rorvig and had Bodil. And I started to think, what? I think what we have here is probably 2 separate women who had similar names, and they lived nearby one another. So without taking the time to use logic on these records, they've just been all attached to one woman who is really a conglomerate of 2 women. But as we look at all these records, we can easily divide the 2 women out into their own unique identities. The fourth tip is to know the laws and how they affected how records were kept and who appeared in those records. I've already talked a little bit in the previous presentation about tax laws and how those affected who would have been listed in the tax lists from year to year. Let's talk about when people try to avoid the law. So here is Bessie Stevens and Sydney Barton. Bless their little teenage souls. They met when they were young and they fell in love. And in 1916, they went to Cleveland County, Oklahoma, and they married. Now, Sydney listed his age as 21 and Bessie listed her age as 18. So this would have given them birth dates around 1895 and 1898. However, when we look at other records from their life, Bessie was born on the 6th of June, 1900, and this is verified by the 1910 census, by a delayed birth certificate filled out in the 1940s, and by the Social Security Death Index. And Sydney was born on the 16th of August, 1897. And this is verified in some other records from his life, the 1900 census, his World War I draft registration, and the Social Security Death Index. So why is there conflicting evidence with their marriage record? Well, it was because the laws of the land would not let them marry without their parents' consent at the ages of 18 and 16. But that is certainly the ages they were when they went to the next county over to get eloped. That's what they did, and they just told a little fib because they wanted to marry without their parents' consent. But it all worked out in the end for these 2. They were happily married for over 50 years. So my next tip is that if you have conflicting evidence and you can't work it out with geography, you can't work it out with logic or any of the other strategies, you have checked your assumptions, you've rechecked all the records you have, you need to go find more evidence. What sources have not been combed yet that could help you resolve this problem? And look beyond the person themselves. You might have found every record that belongs to that particular individual, but have you looked at all of their family members' records? Have you looked at all of the previous generation's records, the younger generation's records? Have you looked at their associates' records? There is usually more evidence out there to be found that can help resolve the conflict. So we have a case of a man named Charles Donahue, who mostly lived in Nelson and Washington counties, Kentucky, and they are neighboring counties. So he just skipped back and forth over the county line a little bit during his life. But in these counties, he was born and raised by his parents. He married Matilda in 1874. He married Rosa after Matilda's death in 1901. He participated in the Civil War in the 6th Kentucky Cavalry. His daughter Rebecca was born in 1875. He's located in all the censuses in these counties, and his burial is also in these counties. However, I found one particular record, which is a pension record actually for his second wife, Rosa. And it states that he died in February 1909 at Durant, Oklahoma. Okay, Durant, Oklahoma. Why? Every other record is in Kentucky. Why is he in Oklahoma dying? What is that about? And then he's back in Kentucky being buried, and his burial, commemorates his 6th Kentucky Cavalry service, and he's near his first wife's burial. So this was definitely a conflict, and I had to figure out what was going on with this. So I had to keep digging, and I really felt like I had exhausted all of his particular records. I didn't know where else to go, but I kept digging. I was looking for all of the records from his wives, his parents, his siblings, and he had a lot of siblings, but nothing was really telling me why he had died in Durant, Oklahoma, if this was correct. And then I finally traced his daughter all the way to her death, and she died in Illinois. And here in her obituary, there's a little line that says, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson moved to East Texas, Kentucky, and from there to Durant, Indian Territory, which would have been what Oklahoma was at the time that they lived there, where they resided for a year. Then they returned to Kentucky, remaining there until 1913. So why was Mr. Charles Donahue, why did he die in Oklahoma? It was because his daughter, his only daughter, had moved there with her husband for a short period of time. They were only there for a year. And either he was living with her at the time, or he had been there to visit when he passed away and was brought back to Kentucky for his burial. So now that we have looked for more evidence, we have resolved our conflict, and we can, write up what we found and how we found it and why we know that that is an accurate place of death and why it makes sense now. Another strategy that you should use in order to resolve conflicting evidence is to compare and contrast until you can create a hypothesis or a proof argument to resolve the conflict. So in this case, we have Mrs. Donahue. I like this Donahue family. They have a lot of conflicts for me to resolve. I wanted to find out her time, her date of death. And I found, I looked in a Kentucky death index, which should have been kept during the time period in which she died. Kentucky was a little sporadic about keeping death records, but the years when she disappeared from other records should have been a time when they were keeping it. So I looked in the index for the death registers, and I did not find any entry for Sarah Donahue. But I couldn't find anything else about her death, so I decided I was going to do a manual search of this death index during the time period. And I found an entry that simply had the surname of Donahue. It said Donahue, female, married, resident of Bardstown, died in Bardstown. That's where this family lived in Nelson County. The date of death was 22nd of January, 1853. That was the time period when she disappeared, so it made great sense. And that she died of psoas abscess. Okay. Now that I had a more narrow time period when she probably died, even though I can't verify this as her yet, I went and dug in the newspapers. And I was able to find this little snippet from Thursday, January 2nd, published in the Bardstown Herald. So again, this is her city where she lived, from 1853. There have been 2 deaths from erysipelas in town since our last issue. Mr. Lucius Melvin and Mrs. Donahue, wife of Mr. Patrick Donahue. There are several cases still on hand, but no new ones so far we have heard. In that part of the county between Bardstown and Bloomfield, which has been so severely afflicted, we understand that the disease has greatly abated. Okay, this article was great. It told me a lot of things. First of all, that she died from erysipelas, that Mrs. Donahue was the wife of Mr. Patrick Donahue. And I had already researched Patrick himself a lot, and I knew there was no other Patrick Donahues in town during this time period. So that was a pretty strong evidence that it was her that had died. And then it also tells me that erysipelas was kind of a little epidemic in town. There had been a lot of cases and several deaths from it. However, there was also a lot of conflicts in these records. So the time of death on the death register said it was the 22nd of January, 1853. But the newspaper article said January 20th. And then the cause of death on the register was psoas abscess, while the article said erysipelas. So which one was it? And then, of course, we have the fact that her first name was never stated in either record. She was just Donahue and then Mrs. Donahue and no first name. But I thought that, I think I can resolve these conflicts by really just comparing and contrasting and writing it up. And that is my last strategy for you. I think every time that you have conflicting evidence, you really need to write it up, what your conclusions were, or even if you haven't resolved it yet, just the conflict that you have, so that future researchers come along and say, yes, they noticed that conflict and they have addressed it in their research. And if you have a solution, you need to lead people along your trail of thought so that they know how you reached your conclusion. So let me show you just one example from the death records for Mrs. Donahue to tell you how I wrote this particular one up. An index search in the Nelson County, Kentucky death records for 1852 to, I said to 1953, but I was really just checking until 1860, yielded nothing for Sarah Donahue. However, a page-by-page search through the time period of 1852 to 1860 showed an incomplete record for a female Donahue, married, resident of Bardstown, dying of psoas abscess on the 22nd of January, 1853. This record, while compelling, could not confirm the date of the death of Sarah Donahue alone. A death notice dated the 20th of January, 1853, printed in the Bardstown Herald, did not provide the first name of Mrs. Donahue, but stated she was the wife of Patrick Donahue, the only Patrick Donahue in town. Her cause of death was erysipelas, which was widespread in the town at that time, the article noted. The dates on the 2 records conflict. The newspaper article was printed the 20th of January, while the physician reported the death was on the 22nd of January. Sarah likely died before the 20th of January in order for the news of her death to be printed by that date. The doctor was working with a local epidemic of erysipelas and reported many deaths sometime after they occurred. And I have that fact just from reading that death register. There's a lot of deaths that he recorded of that particular thing, all in a big chunk. While Sarah's exact date of death remains unknown, the records confirm she died in January 1853. The death cause is different in each document. However, the causes could be related to the same condition. Erysipelas results from a streptococcus bacterial infection, as can psoas abscess. Erysipelas typically causes painful red skin rashes on the extremities and is called St. Anthony's fire. Psoas abscess is a deeper infection of the streptococcus, usually in the lower back and upper thigh in the psoas muscle. This condition is also very painful. It is very likely that Sarah progressed from erysipelas of the skin to the deeper psoas abscess from the same infection, especially at her advanced age of 67. I hope Dueling Dates and Fact Fights Part 1 and 2 have helped you understand more about where and why conflicting evidence occurs in genealogical research and how to resolve it. Thanks for watching. For more great content, check out the RootsTech homepage.